You've got frosting in your ears, sweetheart. The whole dining hall laughed. 200 freshmen. Phones already recording. Nora Whitlock stood there, cake dripping down her face, her grandfather's red headband lying in the ruined frosting at her feet. She didn't cry. She didn't swing. She reached down, picked up that headband, wiped it clean against her sleeve. Then she looked Colton Ashford straight in the eye. You've still got a chance to walk that back. He laughed harder. His father funded half that campus. Nobody had ever told him no. But there was an old custodian mopping near the kitchen door that night. A man who'd spent 30 years around fighters. And he saw something nobody else in that room caught. A half second before impact, when her body dropped low, shoulders squared, trained, Colton had just shoved a world champion's face into a cake. He had 11 weeks left before he found out.
There is a kind of quiet you only find in small towns. Not the quiet of empty streets, the quiet of people who already know each other's business. Ashworth is one of those towns. It sits between two cornfields and a river nobody swims in anymore. The university sits right in the middle of it, like a church built by accident. Every August, the town fills up again. New cars, new faces, nervous parents carrying mini fridges up 3 flights of stairs. This story starts on one of those August nights, the night everyone thought they understood who Nora Whitlock was. They were wrong. It would take them a while to find that out. Nora arrived at Ashworth on a Tuesday. She carried 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. She did not carry much else, no fancy laptop, no designer anything. She did carry one thing that mattered more than all of it. A red headband, folded neat, tucked in the side pocket of her bag, worn soft at the edges, stitched by hand with 3 words. Stand tall, my girl. Her grandfather stitched those words himself, years ago, in a gym that smelled like leather and sweat and old coffee. He was not a man of many words. He saved them for the ones that mattered. Nora kept that headband close, the way some people keep a photograph. She did not wear it in public anymore. She had not worn it in almost 2 years. Her dorm room was small, beige walls, a window that looked out on a parking lot. Her roommate was already there when Nora walked in, a bright-eyed girl named Sadie Holt. Sadie had posters half-taped to the wall, a guitar leaning in the corner, a laugh that filled up a room before she even said a word. "You must be Nora," Sadie said, hopping off her bed. "I saved you the good side. Less noise from the hallway." Nora smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that did not quite reach her eyes yet. "Thanks," she said. "That's kind of you." Sadie tilted her head. She studied her for a second too long. "You're quiet," she said. "Not in a bad way, just noticed." "I've had a loud couple of years," Nora said. "Trying something different." That was all she offered. Sadie did not push. Some people know when to leave a door closed. Sadie was one of them. By evening, the whole freshman class had gathered in the dining hall. It was time for the welcome dinner. Long tables, paper banners, a DJ playing songs from 10 years before any of these students were born. It was meant to be simple. Punch bowls, name tags, a little awkward mingling before real classes began. There was also a cake, a big one, 3 tiers, vanilla frosting. It sat on a table near the center of the room. A banner above it read, "Welcome, Class of Ashworth." Near that cake table stood a young man named Gus Bellamy. Gus was 24, older than most freshmen. He walked with a slight limp, the kind that came from a motorcycle accident 2 years back. He was starting over, same as everybody else in that room, just starting a little later than planned. Gus wasn't loud. He mostly kept to himself. He held a cup of punch he wasn't really drinking. But there was something warm about him, the kind of person who remembers your name after hearing it once. That night, Gus became a target before Nora ever did. It started small. A group of guys near the drink table began mimicking his limp behind his back, laughing a little too loud. One of them started doing an exaggerated walk a few feet from Gus, just close enough for Gus to notice. He wore a varsity jacket, broad shoulders. That young man was Colton Ashford. Colton was hard to miss. 6'2", wide shoulders, the kind of build that came from a wrestling scholarship and a lifetime of nobody telling him no. He wore his family name like a badge. Everybody at Ashworth knew the Ashfords. His father, Gerald Ashford, had a building named after him on the east side of campus. Colton had 2 friends trailing behind him that night. They laughed at everything he said before he even finished saying it. That was how it worked with boys like Colton. Somebody laughs first, everyone else follows. Gus tried to ignore it. He turned toward the cake table, pretending to study the frosting like it was the most interesting thing in the room. That was when Nora noticed. She was standing a few feet away, holding a small stack of napkins, helping one of the dining hall staff set out plates. She saw Colton's exaggerated limp. She saw Gus's jaw tighten. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked closer, calm, easy, like she was simply refilling the napkin holder near Gus. "You want a piece of cake?" she asked Gus, quiet, like it was just the 2 of them in the room. "I heard the bottom tier is the good one." Gus blinked at her, caught off guard by the kindness. "Yeah," he said. "Sure." She cut him a slice, handed it over with a small, steady smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull his attention away from the boys still laughing behind him. Colton noticed the interruption. He didn't like being ignored. He walked over, cup in hand, a smirk already forming. "New girl playing waitress," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "That's cute." Nora didn't answer right away. She kept cutting the cake. Steady hands, calm face. "Just being neighborly," she said. Colton's friends laughed. One of them, a lanky kid named Trip, leaned in. He whispered something to Colton that made him grin wider. "You know," Colton said, stepping closer, "you've got that look. Small town, cheap shoes, probably here on some kind of charity scholarship." A few people nearby went quiet. Sadie, standing across the room, caught the tone shift. She started walking over. Nora set the cake knife down. She looked at Colton, steady, unbothered. "I'm here because I got in," she said simply. "Same as you, I'd guess, unless your dad's name got you in instead." It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was just true. Everybody standing close enough to hear it knew it. An older cafeteria worker named Ruth was working behind the serving line. She had been at Ashworth longer than most of the faculty. She paused what she was doing. She watched the exchange closely. She had seen plenty of freshman years come and go. She had seen plenty of boys like Colton, too, the kind who mistook their father's name for their own character. She did not step in. It was not her place, and she knew it. But she noted the way the new girl held herself, calm as a held breath. Something about it stayed with her the rest of that shift. That was the wrong thing to say to a boy like Colton. In front of an audience like that. His face changed. The smirk stayed, but something behind his eyes went sharp. "Careful," he said, leaning in a little. "New girls who talk too much don't last long around here." "I'll keep that in mind," Nora said. She turned back to the cake, expecting that to be the end of it. It should have been the end of it. Most people faced with that kind of calm would have backed off. Colton was not most people. He had never once in his life had to back down from anything. He did not intend to start in front of a crowd. He reached out fast. He grabbed the back of Nora's head before she even registered the movement. Then he pushed her face straight into the cake. The room went quiet for half a second. Then it exploded into noise. Some people gasped. A few laughed. The nervous kind of laugh people do when they don't know what else to do. Somebody near the back pulled out a phone, already recording. Frosting covered Nora's face, her hair dripping down onto her shirt. She stood there for a moment, bent slightly over the ruined cake, not moving. Colton was already laughing, stepping back, playing to the small crowd that had gathered. "Welcome to Ashworth," he said, grinning at his friends. "Freshman initiation." Tripp was filming now, too. He angled his phone to catch Nora's face as she straightened up. Something small fell from Nora's hair. It landed on the floor near the cake table, a thin strip of red fabric. Her headband had been knocked loose in the shove. Colton, still laughing, reached down and picked it up before she could. He turned it over in his hand, reading the stitching. "Stand tall, my girl," he read out loud, mocking, drawing the words out slow. "That's precious." He tossed it toward the cake. It landed in the ruined frosting right next to her hand. The room was watching now. Every face turned toward the cake table, waiting to see what would happen next. This is the part where people expected Nora to cry, or to scream, or to shove Colton back, to start a fight that would end with both of them getting hauled off by campus security. She did none of that. She reached down, slow and unhurried. She picked the headband up out of the frosting. She wiped it gently against her sleeve, careful with it. The way you handle something that matters more than the mess it's sitting in. Then she wiped her face with a napkin. Calm, deliberate, not rushing. Colton was still grinning, waiting for a reaction that gave him something to work with. Anger, tears, anything. Nora looked at him. Steady eyes, no shake in her voice. "You've still got a chance to walk that back," she said quietly. Colton laughed again, louder this time, playing for his friends. "Walk what back? You've got frosting in your ear, sweetheart." "That's not what I mean," Nora said. "I mean the part where you decide who you're going to be for the next 4 years. You've still got time to choose different." A few people nearby went dead silent. It wasn't the kind of thing you expected to hear from a girl standing there covered in cake frosting. It landed strange in the room, heavier than it should have, for how quiet it was said. Colton's smile faltered for just a second, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel something else. Then he covered it with a shrug. "Whatever," he said. "Enjoy the cake, freshman." He walked off with his friends, already forgetting about it, already on to the next thing that amused him. Nora stood there a moment longer. Then she turned to Gus. He was still standing near the table, stunned, guilty, like he wanted to say something and didn't know what. "You okay?" she asked him. Gus nodded slowly. "I'm the one who should be asking you that." "I'm fine," she said. And somehow, watching her wipe frosting from her collar with steady hands, you almost believed her. Sadie reached her a second later, eyes wide, already pulling tissues from her bag. "Oh my gosh, Nora, are you okay? That was insane. Someone should report him." "It's fine," Nora said again, softer this time. "Let's just go." They left the dining hall together, Sadie fuming the whole walk back, Nora, quiet, calm, holding the red headband tight in her fist the entire way. Behind them, in the dining hall, Tripp was already uploading the video. Within 20 minutes, it had a name. Cake Girl. By morning, half the freshman class had seen it. By the next afternoon, half the school had. Nobody knew, not yet, what that video would come to mean by the end of the semester. Not the students laughing at it in the dining hall, not Colton replaying it for his friends like a highlight reel, not even Nora herself. Lying awake that first night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if coming to Ashworth had been a mistake, she thought more than once that night about calling her old coach back home, a man named Sam Rourke. He had trained alongside her grandfather for almost 20 years. He had sat beside her at the funeral. He told her quietly that she didn't owe the sport anything else if she didn't want to give it. She had his number saved under a plain contact name, nothing that would give anything away if someone ever looked through her phone. She didn't call him that night. She wasn't ready to explain what had happened, or to hear the worry in his voice if she tried. She just held the phone in her hand for a while, thumb hovering over his name, before setting it down on the nightstand and closing her eyes. Some nights, silence is easier than the truth, even when the truth is sitting right there, waiting. 2 people in that building did notice something that night, 2 people who were paying closer attention than anyone realized. The first was an older man named Walt Higgins. Walt worked as the overnight custodian and building supervisor for the dorms. He was 71 years old, broad-shouldered even now, with hands that looked like they'd done real work for most of his life. Walt had been in the dining hall that night, mopping up near the kitchen entrance when the whole thing happened. He hadn't said anything. He rarely did. He'd learned a long time ago that saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment could cost you more than staying quiet. But he'd watched Nora's face as Colton grabbed her. He'd watched the half-second before impact, when her body shifted just slightly, weight dropping low, shoulders squaring, like something in her had reacted on pure instinct before her mind even caught up. It was a small thing. Most people would have missed it entirely. Walt did not miss it. Walt had spent 30 years around fighters. He knew what a trained body looked like when it braced for impact, even when the fighter herself chose not to swing back. He said nothing that night. He just watched her walk out, headband clutched in her fist. Something in his chest went tight with recognition he couldn't quite explain yet. The second person paying attention was Professor Eleanor Voss. She happened to be walking through the dining hall that evening, on her way back from a faculty meeting. Eleanor was 63, a literature professor. She had been at Ashworth for almost 3 decades. She had a reputation for noticing things other people missed. It was part of what made her a good teacher. She had not seen the actual moment of the cake. She arrived just after, catching the tail end of it. Seeing Nora wipe her face clean with a steadiness that didn't match the humiliation she'd just endured. Eleanor did not know Nora yet. She would soon enough. Nora was assigned to her academic advising list, one name among 60 new freshmen she'd meet properly in the coming weeks. But something about the girl's composure stuck with her that night. She thought about it on her drive home, longer than she probably should have. Some people carry their pain loud. Some carry it so quiet you'd never know it's there unless you were looking closely. Eleanor had learned over 30 years of teaching that the quiet ones were usually the ones worth paying attention to. The days that followed were not easy for Nora. The video kept circulating. People she'd never met would glance at her in the hallway, whisper, sometimes laugh outright. Cake Girl became a kind of joke that followed her from building to building. She didn't complain. She didn't post anything online defending herself. She went to her classes, took notes, sat toward the back, kept mostly to herself outside of Sadie. But there were cracks starting to show, if you knew where to look. One evening, about 4 days after the welcome dinner, Sadie came back from the shower. She found Nora in their dorm room alone, hitting a homemade punching bag. She'd rigged it up in the corner using an old duffel bag stuffed with clothes, hung from a hook on the ceiling. Sadie stopped in the doorway, towel still wrapped around her hair, watching for a long moment before Nora even noticed her. The movement was fast, precise, controlled in a way that looked almost professional, not the wild swinging of someone blowing off steam. This was technique, real technique. "Whoa," Sadie said finally. "Where did you learn to do that?" Nora froze mid-punch, breathing hard, suddenly aware she'd been watched. "Just something I picked up," she said, lowering her arms. "Helps me clear my head." "That did not look like something you just picked up," Sadie said, setting her towel down slowly, still staring. "That looked like you've done that a lot." Nora unwrapped the tape from her knuckles, avoiding eye contact. "I used to box a little," she said. "Back home, nothing serious." It was in that moment the smallest lie Nora had ever told, and also one of the biggest. Sadie sensed there was more to it, the way you sense a door that's been shut on purpose. But she didn't push. She had already decided somewhere in the last few days something about Nora. That she was the kind of person who told you things when she was ready, not a moment before. "Well," Sadie said instead, flopping onto her bed, "if you ever want to teach me a thing or two, I would love to know how to throw a punch like that, especially after what happened with Colton." Nora managed a small laugh, the first real one Sadie had heard from her all week. "Maybe someday," she said. That night after Sadie fell asleep, Nora sat by the window with her phone in her hand. She scrolled slowly through old photos she almost never looked at anymore. A gym with peeling blue paint on the walls, a heavy bag hanging from a rusted chain. An old man with silver hair and a gray flannel shirt, standing beside her, one hand resting proudly on her shoulder. Her grandfather, Frank Whitlock, the man who had raised her from the time she was 7 years old, after her parents passed in a car accident on a rainy November night. The man who had taught her everything she knew about boxing, about discipline, about standing tall no matter how hard the world tried to knock you down. The man who had collapsed at ringside during the biggest fight of her career in front of 40,000 people and never got back up. Nora closed the photo app. She set her phone face down on the windowsill. She pressed her palm against her chest for a moment, like she was trying to hold something in place. She had promised herself after the funeral that she was done with boxing, done with cameras, done with being the Iron Rose, the name the world had given her, the name that had cost her the only family she had left. She had come to Ashworth to be nobody, just a freshman, just a girl in a dorm room with a roommate who played guitar too loud and laughed too easy. She hadn't expected somebody like Colton Ashford in her very first week, and she certainly hadn't expected how badly it would test the promise she'd made herself. 2 floors down, on the other side of the building, Walt Higgins sat in the small maintenance office he used during his overnight shifts, staring at an old cardboard box he kept tucked beneath his desk. He hadn't opened that box in years. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he pulled it out anyway. Inside were faded photographs, a few worn magazines, a laminated card that read, "Licensed Amateur Boxing Official, State Athletic Commission," his name printed beneath it. Walt had spent almost 15 years of his younger life working as an amateur boxing referee and cutman, back before a bad hip and a change in circumstance pushed him into a quieter line of work. He didn't talk about that part of his life much anymore. Most people at Ashworth knew him only as the friendly older man who fixed the heating and kept the dorm halls clean. He flipped through a few of the old photographs, faces he hadn't thought about in years, gyms that didn't exist anymore, fighters whose names had faded from memory, except for a rare few who stuck with him. One name stuck harder than the rest, a name from a fight he'd worked as a young referee decades ago, a smaller commission bout that had somehow made its way onto a regional broadcast, a tough, disciplined trainer named Frank Whitlock, and his granddaughter, barely more than a teenager at the time, already showing signs of something special in the ring. Walt closed the box slowly, staring at nothing in particular. He wasn't certain yet. It had been a long time. Faces change, memory plays tricks. But the shift in Nora's stance that night in the dining hall had stirred something in him. That small drop of weight, that squared readiness. He hadn't felt that stirring in years. He decided he would keep watching, quietly, carefully, the way you watch something you're not sure you're allowed to hope for yet. Walt had his own reasons for staying cautious. He remembered another time, years back, when he'd spoken up too soon about something he'd witnessed in a gym that wasn't his to speak on. It had cost him a job he loved. It taught him a hard lesson about timing. He had learned the hard way that being right too early can do just as much damage as staying silent too long. So he decided he would wait. Watch this girl a little longer, learn a little more, before he let himself believe what his gut was already telling him. He put the box back under his desk. He turned off the small lamp. He sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the old building settle around him the way it did every night. Pipes ticking, wind pressing against the windows. It was a sound he found comforting after all these years. A sound that meant, for one more night at least, everything in this building was where it was supposed to be. The following weeks brought their own small storm. Colton, emboldened by the attention the video had gotten him, wasn't finished having his fun. What started as a joke in the dining hall slowly grew into something with more teeth. He started calling Nora Cake Girl to her face. Whenever their paths crossed on campus, always loud enough for others to hear. Always with that same easy grin, like it was all since harmless fun. He got a few of his wrestling teammates in on it too, small things at first. A tray accidentally knocked over near her table. A comment shouted across the quad. Little jabs meant to keep her small, keep her embarrassed, keep the joke alive. Gus, still carrying guilt from that first night, tried to speak up for her once. He caught Colton in the hallway outside the gym. "Hey man," Gus said, keeping his voice level. "That whole cake thing, that wasn't cool. Maybe let it go." Colton looked him over, unimpressed. "You want a turn too?" he said, tilting his head at Gus's leg. "I could arrange a group discount." Gus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing else. He walked away, feeling worse than before he'd said anything at all. Word got back to Nora about the exchange later that day, through Sadie, who'd heard it from someone in her chemistry class. Nora found Gus that evening near the library, sitting alone on a bench, staring at nothing. "I heard what happened," she said, sitting down beside him. "With Colton?" Gus shook his head. "I made it worse. Should have just kept my mouth shut." "You stood up for someone?" Nora said. "That's never worse." Gus glanced at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "You don't seem angry about any of this, the cake thing, the nickname, any of it." Nora looked out across the quad, watching a few students toss a frisbee under the fading evening light. "I am angry," she admitted quietly. "I just don't let it decide what I do next." Gus considered that for a long moment. "How do you manage that?" Nora was quiet for a while before answering. "Someone taught me a long time ago that anger is just fuel," she said. "It's not a plan. You can burn it up doing something stupid, or you can save it for the moment it actually matters." Gus nodded slowly, like the words settled somewhere deep. "Sounds like somebody smart taught you that." Nora's eyes softened, just slightly, a flicker of something unspoken passing behind them. "He was," she said. "The smartest man I ever knew." She didn't offer more than that. Gus didn't ask. But something about the way she said it, past tense, careful, protective, told him there was a story there, bigger than either of them understood yet. By the end of that first week, the video had mostly moved on from the campus spotlight, the way these things always do, replaced by some other minor scandal, some other viral clip. But the damage had settled into something quieter and more permanent, a reputation, a label. "Cake Girl" whispered in hallways, tagged onto Nora's name like a shadow she couldn't shake. Colton, for his part, felt untouchable. He'd grown up that way. His father's name opened doors before Colton even had to knock. Teachers who might have disciplined other students for similar behavior tended to look the other way when it came to an Ashford. It wasn't written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. Everyone at Ashworth understood the unspoken arithmetic of money and influence. Gerald Ashford had donated the new athletic center 2 years earlier. His name sat carved in stone above the entrance. The university's biggest annual fundraising gala was scheduled for later that semester, the one where scholarships were announced publicly in front of donors, faculty, and local press. It was named in his honor. Colton knew all of this, even if he never said it out loud. He knew that whatever trouble he stirred up, it would take something extraordinary to actually land on him with any real weight. He had no idea walking around campus that week feeling untouchable that the quiet girl he'd humiliated carried a weight of her own, a different kind of weight, built from years of discipline, from loss, from a promise she'd made to a man who was no longer alive to see whether she kept it. He had no idea that somewhere in that dorm building an old custodian sat with a dusty cardboard box, slowly starting to remember a name he hadn't thought of in years. He had no idea that a professor down the hall from the dean's office had already begun quietly pulling old disciplinary files, curious about a pattern she couldn't quite explain yet, but couldn't ignore either. And he certainly had no idea about the rest of it. The girl he'd shoved face first into a cake had once stood in the center of a ring in front of 40,000 people. Gloves raised, heart pounding, carrying a world championship belt over her shoulder. While the crowd chanted a name that wasn't Nora at all, they chanted a name that meant something different. A name earned through years of sacrifice most people never see. a name that belonged to a version of her she thought she'd left behind for good.
The Iron Rose.
Nobody at Ashworth knew that name yet. Not Colton, not Sadie, not even Gus, who was closer to the truth than anyone realized. But names have a way of finding their way back to the surface, especially when the people who carry them are pushed hard enough, long enough, far enough past the point where silence stops being strength and starts being something closer to surrender. That Friday evening, exactly 1 week after the welcome dinner, Ashworth held its first big social gathering of the semester, an outdoor bonfire near the edge of the athletic fields, meant to bring the freshman class together after a rocky first week. Nora almost didn't go. Sadie convinced her. She promised it would be low-key, mostly just music snacks, and a chance to breathe outside their small dorm room for a few hours. It should have been simple. Nothing more than a quiet night under a wide-open sky. Stars starting to show above the tree line, a small fire crackling in a stone pit surrounded by folding chairs and blankets. But Colton was there too, of course, holding court near the fire with his usual crowd, already a little loud, already looking for the next opportunity to remind everyone exactly who he was. He spotted Nora the moment she and Sadie arrived. Something in his expression shifted into that familiar grin, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "Well, look who it is," he called out, loud enough for half the fire pit to hear. "Cake Girl decided to show up." A few people laughed, a few others shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Colton and Nora, unsure what was about to happen. Nora didn't answer. She kept walking, guiding Sadie toward a set of open chairs on the far side of the fire, doing her best to simply exist in that space without giving Colton the reaction he wanted. But Colton wasn't finished. He never was. He stood, cup in hand, and walked toward her with that same easy, dangerous confidence. His friends trailed behind, already filming again on their phones, sensing another moment worth capturing. "You know," Colton said, stopping a few feet from her, voice pitched loud enough for the whole gathering to hear, "I've been thinking about that little speech you gave me last week, about walking things back, about choosing who I'm going to be." He smiled, slow and mean. "I've decided," he said. "I'm going to be exactly who I've always been." The fire crackled between them. A few dozen freshmen sat frozen around the flames, unsure whether to watch or look away. Nora stood still, steady, unreadable. "That's a shame," she said quietly. "I was hoping you'd surprise me." Colton laughed, short and sharp, glancing back at his friends like she'd just handed him a punchline. "Careful, Cake Girl," he said, stepping closer, close enough now that Sadie instinctively moved between them. "You're not as untouchable as you think you are." Nora's eyes didn't waver, not even a flicker. "I never said I was untouchable," she said. "I just said you still have a choice." Something about the way she said it unsettled him, calm, unbothered, almost patient. It rattled Colton more than any shout or shove ever could have. His jaw tightened. His friends had gone quiet, sensing the moment had shifted into something they didn't fully understand. Colton opened his mouth to say something else, something sharper, something meant to reassert control of a moment that suddenly didn't feel like his anymore. But before he could, a low, steady voice cut through the night air from just beyond the firelight. "Everything all right over here?" It was Walt, making his evening rounds along the edge of the athletic fields, drawn by the sound of raised voices carrying across the grass. He stepped into the firelight slowly, hands tucked into the pockets of his work jacket, his presence somehow calming the entire clearing without a single raised word. Colton straightened, adjusting his posture the way young men do around older authority figures they don't fully respect but still instinctively fear. "We're fine," Colton said, forcing a casual tone. "Just talking." Walt's eyes moved slowly from Colton to Nora to the small crowd gathered around the fire, taking in far more than anyone realized. "Good," Walt said simply. "Then everybody can head on back to enjoying their night." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even particularly stern. but something about the steadiness in Walt's voice made Colton step back without another word. The quiet authority of a man who had clearly seen far more in his life than anyone at that fire pit could guess. He shot one last look at Nora, something unreadable behind his eyes, before turning and walking back toward his friends, waving off the tension like it had never happened at all. The fire crackled on. Music started playing again from a speaker near the food table. Slowly, cautiously, conversation returned to the clearing, the way normal life always finds its way back after a moment of held breath. Walt lingered a moment longer, his eyes settling briefly on Nora, who was helping Sadie back into her chair, hands steady despite everything that had just happened. He didn't say anything to her that night, not yet. He wasn't ready. He needed to be sure first. Sure of what his memory was trying to tell him, sure of a name he hadn't spoken out loud in years. He turned to continue his rounds. Walking slowly back across the dark field, he found himself thinking about that old cardboard box beneath his desk, about the fight he refereed decades ago, about a young trainer named Frank Whitlock, standing proud beside a girl who threw a jab like nobody Walt had ever seen before or since. He thought about the way Nora had stood her ground tonight, calm as still water, while a boy twice her size in ego tried and failed to rattle her. He thought about the phrase she'd used, not once but twice now. "You still have a choice." It sounded like something a fighter would say, not a boxer swinging wild with anger, a real fighter. The kind trained to understand that restraint isn't weakness, it's the deepest kind of strength there is. Walt walked the rest of his rounds that night with his mind somewhere else entirely, turning over a growing certainty he wasn't ready to say out loud. Somewhere across campus, in a small office lined with books, Professor Eleanor Voss sat late into the evening, a manila folder open on her desk, filled with old disciplinary complaints spanning nearly a decade. Complaints that had been filed and then curiously, quietly closed without explanation. Complaints involving a familiar set of last names attached to the university's biggest donors. She didn't have all the pieces yet. She wasn't even sure what picture they were forming, but something about the pattern nagged at her, the way certain sentences in certain student essays sometimes nagged at her. Small inconsistencies that meant nothing on their own, but everything once you saw enough of them lined up together. She thought about Nora Whitlock, the quiet freshman on her advising list, the one everyone on campus had already reduced to a cruel nickname after a single humiliating night. She made a note in the margin of her folder, a small reminder to herself. Check in with Whitlock. Something doesn't add up here. Eleanor had been teaching long enough to know something about universities. For all their talk of integrity, they were still institutions built and funded by people. And people came with loyalties. She had watched over the years a slow drift in how certain complaints were handled. A parking violation against a scholarship athlete got a stern warning. The same violation against a student on financial aid got a fine and a note in a permanent file. It was never anything you could point to directly. It was always small. A pattern made of 100 small things, each one easy enough to explain away on its own. She closed the folder and rubbed her eyes, feeling every one of her 63 years settle into her shoulders. She thought about her own daughter, grown now and living 2 states away. She used to tell her that, back when her daughter was young and being teased at school, that the loudest kid in the room is very rarely the strongest one. It was a small thing to say to a child. It had turned out to be one of the truest things Eleanor had ever told anyone. She thought about Nora Whitlock's face in that grainy video, calm in a way that unsettled her more than tears would have. She thought about the way real strength so rarely announces itself. It usually just stands there quiet, waiting to be tested properly before it shows what it's made of. She turned off her desk lamp a little after 11 that night, locked her office, walked out into the cool evening air, already planning what she would say when she finally sat down with that freshman face to face. The days that followed the bonfire brought a strange kind of calm to campus. The surface kind, where everyone seems to move on even though nothing underneath has actually been resolved. Classes settled into their rhythm, The dining hall stopped buzzing quite so loud about the cake incident. New gossip took its place, the way it always does on a campus full of 18 and 19-year-olds discovering independence for the first time. But underneath that calm, 3 separate threads kept quietly pulling tighter. Walt kept his eyes open during his rounds, watching the way Nora moved through hallways, the way she held doors for people without being asked, the way she never seemed to raise her voice even when provoked. He started leaving his old boxing magazines out on his desk during his breaks, half hoping, half testing to see if she'd ever notice them and say something. She never did. She was careful. Careful in a way that told him more than anything else could have that she had good reason to be. Eleanor scheduled Nora in for a standard advising appointment, the kind every freshman got during their first month, nothing that would raise suspicion. She planned her questions carefully, gentle ones, the kind meant to open a door rather than kick one down, and Colton, for his part, grew bolder rather than more cautious, the way boys like him usually did when nobody with real authority ever stopped them. He started testing smaller lines around campus, watching how far the Ashford name could stretch before anyone pushed back. He never touched Nora again, not physically, not after that night by the fire. But his words got sharper, his crowd got louder. He was, without fully realizing it yet, building toward something that would eventually cost him everything he thought his name protected him from. Nora, through all of it, kept her promise to herself. She went to class. She studied late into the evenings with Sadie, who had quietly appointed herself Nora's closest friend on campus without ever needing to ask permission. She hid her makeshift punching bag in the corner of the dorm room a little more often than she probably should have, letting her hands remember a rhythm her mind was still trying to forget. She thought about her grandfather almost every day, not with the raw, aching grief of those first months after the funeral, but with something softer now. Something closer to memory settling into its proper place. She thought about the way he used to tell her something, after every fight, win or lose, that the scoreboard never mattered half as much as who you chose to be when nobody was watching. She hadn't fully understood what he meant back then. She was starting to understand it now. In a dining hall 3 states away from home, in a dorm room with a roommate who didn't yet know the whole truth, in a town that had no idea what kind of storm was quietly building beneath its calm September surface. Back in the small dorm room across campus, Nora sat by the window long after Sadie had fallen asleep. The sounds of the bonfire long since faded into the quiet hum of a college campus settling in for the night. She held the red headband in her hands, running her thumb slowly over the worn stitching. "Stand tall, my girl." She thought about her grandfather's voice, low and steady, the way he used to say those words to her before every fight, every weigh-in, every moment she stepped into a ring not knowing if she'd walk back out a winner. She thought about the promise she'd made at his funeral, standing at the edge of an open grave with rain falling soft around her, swearing she was done, swearing the ring had taken enough from her already. She thought about Colton's grin in the firelight, and the way half the freshman class had watched, waiting to see if she'd finally break. She hadn't broken, not yet, but something in her had shifted that night, something quiet and small, the way the tide shifts long before anyone standing on the shore ever notices the water creeping higher. Nora folded the headband carefully. She tucked it back into her drawer, beneath a stack of folded shirts, hidden but not forgotten. Outside her window, the campus lights flickered against a clear autumn sky. Somewhere far beyond the edge of that small town, a piece of Nora's past sat waiting patiently to be found. By the second week of September, 3 weeks after that first cake, Ashworth had mostly settled into its normal rhythm, classes, study groups, the slow grind of a semester finding its shape. Nora found her own rhythm too. Quiet mornings, long afternoons at the library, evenings with Sadie and sometimes Gus, talking about nothing important. It almost felt some days like the version of ordinary she'd come here looking for. It wouldn't stay that way much longer. 3 weeks into the semester, Ashworth had settled into its rhythm. Classes, study groups, the slow grind of routine. For Nora Whitlock, that rhythm brought something else, too, a shift she could feel coming. The way you feel weather before it arrives. It started on a Tuesday evening when Walt Higgins found her alone in the small laundry room at the end of her dorm hallway. She was folding a stack of towels, headphones in. Unaware he'd come in behind her, he didn't announce himself right away, he just stood in the doorway a moment, watching the careful, economical way she moved. Everything about her had a rhythm to it, nothing wasted. "Mind if I sit a minute?" he said finally. "These old knees don't love standing shifts like they used to." Nora pulled one earbud out, startled but polite. "Of course, go ahead." Walt lowered himself onto the plastic chair near the folding table, with a small groan. The kind older men make when their bodies remind them again that they aren't young anymore. For a while, neither of them said much, just the hum of the dryers, the smell of fabric softener, the quiet clatter of buttons against metal drums. Then Walt spoke. Careful, like a man setting something fragile down on a table. "You ever hear of a fighter went by the name Iron Rose?" Nora's hands stopped moving. It was only a second, half a second maybe, but Walt saw it. He'd spent a lifetime reading small, involuntary things in people's faces. First, as a referee watching for the moment a fighter's eyes went glassy. Later, as a father watching his own children learn to lie about homework. Nora recovered quickly, resuming her folding, keeping her voice even. "Can't say I have," she said. "Should I have?" Walt studied her for a long moment before answering. "Maybe not," he said. "Just an old memory is all. I used to referee amateur fights years back, small circuit stuff mostly, but every now and then you'd get a fighter who didn't belong on a small circuit at all, somebody just passing through on her way to somewhere much bigger." He watched her carefully as he continued. "There was a young trainer I worked with a handful of times. Sharp man, quiet, never raised his voice, not even in a fighter's corner during the toughest rounds. He had a granddaughter he brought up through the amateurs himself. I only saw her fight once, but I never forgot it. Fastest hands I ever watched cross a ring, moved like she already knew what her opponent was going to do before they did it themselves." Nora set the towel down slowly, her hands no longer steady. "That trainer's name," Walt said, quiet now, gentle, like he was handling something breakable, "was Frank Whitlock." The dryer buzzed and clicked off behind them. Neither of them moved to open it. Nora stood very still, staring down at the folding table, her jaw tight. "How do you know that name?" she said, barely above a whisper. She glanced toward the small window near the ceiling, half expecting somebody to be listening, though the hallway outside stood empty and quiet. "I refereed one of her fights," Walt said, "a long time ago. I never forgot her stance, never forgot the way she carried herself, even at that age. Calm, controlled, like she understood something about restraint that fighters twice her age never learned." He paused. "I saw that same stance in you. First week of the semester, in the dining hall. Before that boy ever touched you, your body already knew what was coming, braced for it, trained for it." Nora closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something in her had shifted, some wall she'd been holding up for 2 years finally just slightly beginning to crack. "He passed away," she said quietly. "My grandfather. Almost 2 years ago now. At ringside, during my last fight." Walt didn't say anything right away. He let the silence hold the weight it needed to hold. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That's a hard thing to carry." "I stopped fighting after that," Nora said. "I told myself I was done. Told myself I'd come here and just be somebody normal. Somebody nobody expected anything from." She wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed, though Walt made no move to react like it was anything to be embarrassed about. "I'm not saying you owe anybody an explanation," Walt said. "I'm saying I recognized something in you. I wanted you to know you're not as invisible as you think you are. Not to everybody." Nora managed a small, tired smile. "You're the first person here who's said her name," she said. "Iron Rose. Nobody's said it out loud since I got here. I imagine that was on purpose, Walt said. It was, Nora admitted. Walt nodded slowly, rising from the chair with some effort, his knees protesting the movement. Your secret's safe with me, he said. I just wanted you to know somebody in this building sees you a little clearer than the rest of them do. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, he added, your grandfather would be proud of the woman folding towels in this laundry room. Championship belt or not, he left before she could respond. Nora stood there a long moment after the door closed, one hand pressed against her chest, breathing slow and deliberate, the way her grandfather taught her to breathe before stepping through the ropes. She sat back down on the plastic chair after he'd gone, the towels forgotten beside her. She let herself cry for the first time in weeks. Not loud, not long, just a few quiet minutes where she allowed herself to miss her grandfather, without trying to hold it together for anybody watching. When she finally composed herself, she pulled out her phone. She typed a short message to Sam Rourke, the first she'd sent him since arriving at Ashworth. Someone here remembers Grandpa, an old boxing referee. Made me realize how much I still miss it. Miss you too. Hope the gym's treating you well. She almost deleted it before sending. In the end, she let it go through. She felt a small measure of relief the moment it did, like setting down a bag she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Sam wrote back within the hour, the way he always did, steady and unhurried. A man who had spent decades learning that the right words mattered more than fast ones. Your grandfather's memory doesn't need me to keep it alive. It lives in you, kid. Whenever you're ready for any of it again, ring or otherwise, I'm one phone call away. Always have been. Nora read the message twice before setting her phone down. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long while. The distance between the person she used to be and the person hiding at Ashworth wasn't quite as wide as she'd let herself believe. 2 floors away in her office, lined with worn paperback spines, Professor Eleanor Voss sat behind a desk covered in manila folders, the fluorescent light above her humming faintly in the quiet. She had spent the better part of 3 evenings now pulling old disciplinary records from the registrar's shared archive, records she technically had access to as a senior faculty advisor, records nobody usually bothered reading twice. What she found unsettled her more each night. A formal complaint filed 4 years earlier by a student named Priscilla Danvers, accusing a member of the wrestling team of harassment. Closed within a week. No further action noted, no explanation given. A separate complaint 2 years after that, a different student, a different sport, same pattern. Closed, no explanation. A third complaint last spring, this one involving Colton Ashford by name, filed by a resident advisor who no longer worked at the university. Closed within 72 hours. The RA's employment ended less than a month later. Officially listed as a voluntary resignation. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing the bridge of her nose. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet. Universities closed complaints for all sorts of reasons. Lack of evidence, withdrawn statements, mediation instead of formal discipline. But 3 cases stood out, all involving the same handful of donor family names. All closed within days instead of the usual weeks it took the university to process anything. That formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. She thought about the gala coming up in a few weeks, the Ashford Scholarship Dinner, an event the university treated like its biggest night of the year. Local news cameras, major donors, speeches about integrity and opportunity, delivered under chandeliers paid for by the very families whose sons seemed to walk away from consequences again and again. It struck her sitting there that night how carefully the university had built its own reflection. Every brochure, every campus tour, every speech at freshman orientation leaned on words like honor and community and character. Eleanor had believed those words herself once, young and idealistic. Back when she first accepted her position all those decades ago, she still believed the institution could live up to them. She simply no longer believed it would happen on its own. Not without somebody willing to hold the door open and insist the truth walk through it. She thought about Nora Whitlock. sitting quiet and composed in her office 2 weeks earlier during their first advising appointment, answering every question carefully, revealing almost nothing personal. The way people do when they've learned the hard way that oversharing costs more than it's worth. Eleanor closed the folder, locked it in her desk drawer. She made a decision that night, one she would later come to see as one of the most important of her career. She would keep pulling threads, quietly, carefully, until she understood exactly what kind of pattern she was looking at. To be thorough, Eleanor did something she rarely allowed herself to do with a student's file. She looked into Nora's academic record from her previous school, a small community college back in her home state, curious whether anything there might explain the strange 2-year gap between her high school graduation and her enrollment at Ashworth. What she found was mostly unremarkable: strong grades, a note about a leave of absence during her second semester, listed only as personal circumstances. No further detail given. Nothing that explained the composure Eleanor had witnessed in that dining hall video. The kind of stillness that usually took either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary loss to build. Eleanor suspected, without any real evidence yet, that it might be both. She thought about reaching out directly, asking Nora outright what she was missing from that picture. But something told her that girl would only open that door when she was good and ready. Pressing too hard too soon might close it for good. So Eleanor did the only thing she knew how to do well after 30 years in this profession. She waited. She watched. She kept the folder locked in her drawer, ready for the moment it might actually matter. Colton Ashford, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening around him. He moved through campus the way he always had, loud, easy, certain of his place in the world. If anything, the weeks since the bonfire had made him bolder, not more careful. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody ever really had. He kept his jabs at Nora subtler now, small enough to avoid drawing attention from faculty, but sharp enough to keep the joke alive among his circle of friends. A muttered nickname in passing, an exaggerated flinch whenever she walked near the dining hall, like he was bracing for another cake. It was petty. It was cruel in the quiet, casual way cruelty often is, among people who've never faced a real consequence for it. But petty cruelty has a way of escalating when it stops satisfying the person doing it. By the middle of October, the small jabs had stopped being enough for Colton. The escalation started with money. Every fall, the sophomore class council collected a modest activity fund. Dues paid by students to cover the cost of homecoming decorations, a small dance, a handful of community events through the semester. That year, the fund sat in a locked metal box kept in the student activities office, a little over $1,100 collected across the first 2 months of school. On a Thursday morning in mid-October, the class treasurer discovered the box missing from its usual shelf. By that afternoon, campus security had been called. By that evening, a rumor had already started making its way through the sophomore class. One that traced its origin curiously back to a comment Colton made to a few of his teammates in the dining hall. "Kind of convenient," he'd said, loud enough for people nearby to overhear. "That new scholarship girl's been seen hanging around the student activities building a lot lately. Working odd hours there too, I heard." It wasn't true. Nora had been in that building exactly twice. Both times for a work-study shift helping catalog textbooks in a storage room 2 floors above the activities office. Nowhere near where the fund box was kept. But rumors don't need truth to spread. They only need somebody willing to say them loud enough, often enough, to enough people. By Friday morning, the rumor had solidified into something closer to accusation. By Friday afternoon, campus security had pulled the surveillance footage from the hallway outside the activities office, looking for anyone who might have accessed the room during the time frame the money went missing. The footage from that specific stretch of hallway, spanning the exact 3-hour window investigators needed, was corrupted. A rare, unexplained camera malfunction, according to the report filed by campus IT. The kind of malfunction that happened maybe once or twice a year, according to the technician who filed it. Nobody thought to question the timing too closely. Nobody except Walt. He happened to overhear 2 security officers discussing it near the maintenance office later that week, shaking their heads about the bad luck of it all. Walt didn't say anything to the officers, but something about it didn't sit right with him. He found himself thinking about it long after his shift ended that night. By Monday, Nora had been called into the Dean of Students' office for what was described carefully as a routine conversation. It was not routine. She understood that the moment she sat down across from Dean Marlowe, a tired-looking administrator in his 50s, he clearly did not want to be having this meeting any more than she wanted to be sitting in it. "There's been an allegation," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "regarding the missing activity fund." "I've never touched that fund," Nora said, calm direct. "I've been in that building twice, both times for work study. Both times nowhere near the office where it's kept." "I understand," Dean Marlowe said, "and I want to be clear, no formal charges have been filed. We're simply following up on information that's come to our attention." "What information?" Nora asked. The dean hesitated. "There have been some comments circulating, students who've mentioned seeing you around that area more than expected." "Students," Nora repeated. "Do any of these students have names? Or is this just something people are saying?" Dean Marlowe shifted uncomfortably. "At this stage, we're simply asking questions, nothing more." Nora sat back in her chair, steady, though something behind her eyes had gone hard and focused, the way it used to look right before a fight when an opponent tried an underhanded tactic in the ring. A low blow, an elbow that shouldn't have landed, something the referee might not have caught, but she certainly had. "I think we both know where this rumor started," she said quietly. The dean didn't answer that directly. He simply thanked her for her time, told her the matter was still under review, asked her to make herself available if further questions arose. Nora walked out of that office with her composure fully intact on the outside. On the inside, something had started to burn, low and steady. The kind of anger she had spent 2 years learning to control rather than release. She stopped by the dining hall on her way back to her dorm, more out of habit than hunger. She found Ruth behind the serving line, wiping down the counter for the evening shift. Ruth had watched enough freshmen come and go over the years. She could recognize trouble sitting on somebody's shoulders before they said a word about it. "You look like you're carrying something," Ruth said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter without being asked. "On the house. You look like you need it more than you need to pay for it." Nora managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you." "That Ashford boy giving you more trouble?" Ruth asked, lowering her voice slightly. Nora hesitated, surprised the older woman had noticed anything at all. "Something like that." Ruth shook her head slowly, wiping the counter with more force than the job strictly required. "I've worked this line for 19 years. Watched plenty of boys like him walk through here thinking the world owes them a favor just for showing up. Most of them grow out of it eventually. Some of them never do. Either way, it's never the fault of the person they decide to step on along the way." "Thanks, Ruth," Nora said quietly. "Don't thank me," Ruth said. "Just don't let people like that convince you you're smaller than you are. I've watched you in here for weeks now. You don't strike me as somebody who scares easy." Nora carried that coffee and those words back to her dorm room that night. She found herself thinking about them long after the cup had gone cold. She didn't tell Sadie right away. She didn't tell Gus. She sat with it for a full day. Then she finally found herself back in the laundry room that evening, not folding towels this time, just sitting on the same plastic chair Walt had used weeks earlier, staring at the wall. Walt found her there, again. An odd sort of symmetry neither of them commented on directly. "You look like a woman carrying something heavy," he said, settling into the chair across from her. She told him everything. The missing fund, the rumor, the corrupted camera footage, the dean's careful, non-committal questions. Walt listened without interrupting, his expression darkening slightly as she spoke. "That corrupted footage," he said once she'd finished, "happened during the exact window they needed it." "That's what I thought too," Nora said. "Feels less like bad luck and more like somebody made sure it disappeared." Walt was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. "I want to tell you something," he said finally. Something I haven't told anybody in a long time. Nora looked up at him, waiting. Years back, Walt said, before I ever came to work at this university, I worked security at a different building downtown. There was an incident, a bad one, involving a young man whose family had money and influence in this town, and a young woman who worked in that building who didn't. I saw what happened. I knew what happened. But when it came time to say something, the story that got told wasn't the one I witnessed. It was the one that protected the family with money.
He paused, his jaw tight.
I didn't speak up, he said. I told myself it wasn't my place, told myself nobody would believe me over a family like that anyway. I've regretted it every day since. Nora watched him carefully, sensing there was more coming. After that, Walt continued, I made myself a promise. If I was ever in a position again where I could quietly protect myself from something like that happening around me, I would. So when I started this job, I installed a small camera of my own, at my own expense, covering the stretch of hallway and parking area outside this dormitory. Not connected to the university system, just mine. A little insurance, in case I ever needed proof of something the official record might conveniently forget. Nora's eyes widened slightly. You have your own footage. I do, Walt said, going back months. I've never had to use it for anything, never needed to, until now, maybe. Does it cover the activities building? Nora asked. Walt shook his head. No, just this building, this parking lot. But if something happens near here involving you, I'd have it on record, separate from whatever the university's system might mysteriously lose. It wasn't a complete solution. It didn't clear her of the fund accusation, but it was something. A small, quiet safety net neither of them had expected to need. Sitting there in a laundry room lit by a single flickering overhead bulb. Thank you, Nora said softly, for telling me. Don't thank me yet, Walt said. I should have said something the moment I noticed that footage went missing on the activities building side. I was still deciding how without putting either of us in a worse spot. Sometimes doing the right thing slow is still better than not doing it at all. But I won't wait again, not this time. The following week brought the escalation neither of them had fully anticipated. It happened on a cold Wednesday night, the kind where the temperature drops fast after sundown. Everyone walks a little quicker across the quad to get back indoors. Sadie had stayed late at the library finishing a paper, later than she'd meant to. She was walking back to the dorm alone through the parking lot that connected the academic buildings to the residence halls. It wasn't the safest shortcut, but it was the fastest one. She'd taken it a dozen times without incident. This time was different. Colton and two of his teammates, Tripp among them, were cutting through the same lot on their way back from a late practice. Still keyed up from whatever competitive energy the gym had left in them, they spotted Sadie walking alone. Something in Colton's mood, already sour from a rough practice, decided this was an opportunity worth taking. Hey, Colton called out, jogging a few steps to catch up with her. You're that roommate, Cake Girl's roommate. Sadie kept walking, quickening her pace slightly. I'm not doing this right now, Colton. Relax, he said, falling into step beside her. His friends trailed a few feet back, laughing at something between themselves. Just want to ask you something. You think your little friend's really as innocent as she acts? Because I've got a pretty good guess about where that missing fund ended up. You know that's not true, Sadie snapped, stopping and turning to face him. You started that rumor yourself. Everybody knows it. Colton's smile faded slightly, replaced by something colder. Careful, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping. People who spread rumors about me tend to have a rough time around here. Sadie's back was nearly against a parked car now, Colton close enough that she could smell the gym on him, sweat and nerves and something meaner underneath. That was the moment Nora rounded the corner of the lot, walking back from a late shift shelving books. She saw the scene unfolding 20 feet ahead of her. She didn't run, she didn't shout. She simply walked, fast and purposeful, straight toward them. Her voice cutting through the cold night air before she'd even fully closed the distance. Colton! He turned, startled, some of his earlier confidence flickering at the sight of her. Well, if it isn't Cake Girl herself, he said, recovering quickly.
Perfect timing.
Back up, Nora said, stepping between him and Sadie, her voice low, level, absolutely certain. Now. Or what? Colton said, laughing, though it came out a little forced. You gonna hit me? Go ahead. Give me a reason. Nora didn't move. She stood perfectly still, weight balanced, hands relaxed at her sides, every part of her radiating a stillness that unsettled Tripp and the other teammate enough that they started backing away toward their car. I'm not going to hit you, Nora said. I'm telling you to back away from my friend. Something about the calm certainty in her voice seemed to enrage him. The total absence of fear rattled him more than any shout could have. He stepped forward fast, closing the distance between them, reaching out to shove her shoulder. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Nora shifted her weight. A small, almost invisible movement. Colton's shove meant nothing but empty air where she'd been standing a half-second earlier. Off balance from the miss, his own momentum carried him forward. He stumbled, caught his foot awkwardly on a raised section of curb, went down hard onto the pavement. For a moment, the parking lot went completely silent. Colton lay sprawled on the ground, more startled than hurt, his teammates frozen a few feet away. Then Colton did something neither Nora nor Sadie expected. He grabbed at his own shoulder and started shouting, "She hit me! Everybody saw it! She just attacked me!" Tripp, quick to catch on, already had his phone out, angling it toward Colton on the ground, catching only the aftermath, the fall, the shouting, nothing of the moment that actually happened. "I didn't touch you," Nora said, disbelief flashing across her face for the first time that whole encounter. "Save it!" Colton spat, pushing himself up, wincing dramatically, clutching his shoulder like it had taken real damage. "You're done. You understand me? This is over for you." He limped toward his car with his friends. Tripp, still filming, capturing Nora and Sadie standing in the parking lot looking shaken. Within the hour, that footage would be edited down, cut into a clip that made it look exactly like what Colton wanted it to look like. Sadie grabbed Nora's arm, her voice shaking. "That's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened." "I know," Nora said quietly, watching Colton's car pull away. "But it doesn't matter what happened. It matters what people believe happened." They walked back to the dorm in silence, both of them replaying the last 2 minutes over and over, trying to understand how something so clearly one-sided could be twisted so completely, so fast. Back in their room, Sadie paced the small space, still shaking with adrenaline. "We need to tell someone. Right now. Tonight." "Tell them what?" Nora said, sitting down slowly on the edge of her bed. "That a girl with no history of trouble is claiming a boy whose father funds half this school made up a story about her? You saw how fast that fund rumor spread. This will spread faster. So we just let him win?" Sadie asked, incredulous. "No," Nora said. "We just don't hand him a win by panicking tonight. We think it through." Gus stopped by their room an hour later, having heard a garbled version of the parking lot incident secondhand from someone in his study group. He knocked softly, waited to be let in, sat quietly on the floor near the door once Sadie waved him inside, listening as they walked him through what had actually happened. "This isn't right," Gus said, his voice tight with anger he rarely let show. "None of this is right. First the cake, now this. When does it stop?" "I don't know," Nora admitted. "But getting angry at the wrong moment won't help anybody. I learned that the hard way, a long time ago." Gus looked at her carefully. "You keep saying things like that, like you've been through something bigger than this before." He said it gently, not as an accusation, just an honest observation from someone who'd spent enough time around her now to notice the shape of what she wasn't saying. Nora held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away, saying nothing. Gus didn't push, he simply nodded, understanding there were parts of her story that weren't his to ask about yet. "Whatever happens," he said instead, "you should know you've got people in your corner, real people, not just whoever Colton's convinced to laugh along with him." It wasn't much, but in a week that had taken so much from her already, it was enough. Nora fell asleep that night without the weight in her chest pressing quite so hard against her ribs. By the next morning, the edited clip had already made its way to several group chats across campus. By noon, campus security had reviewed it and flagged it for the dean's office. By that afternoon, Nora received a formal summons, this time not for a routine conversation, for an emergency disciplinary meeting. Walt heard about it before Nora even had a chance to tell him herself. Word traveling fast through the small network of maintenance staff and security officers who worked the overnight shifts. He pulled his personal footage that same evening, reviewing hours of parking lot recording until he found the exact window from the night before. It was there, clear as day. Time-stamped, unedited, Colton's shove missing entirely, his own momentum sending him to the ground, no contact from Nora whatsoever. Walt sat alone in his small office that night, staring at the footage, replaying it 3 times to be absolutely certain of what he was seeing. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself years ago, the one he'd broken once already and regretted every day since. He thought about Nora's face in the laundry room, the way she'd said nobody here had said her grandfather's fighting name out loud until he did. He thought about the way real courage doesn't announce itself loudly. It usually just sits quiet in a small office at night, deciding finally that this time will be different. He didn't act that night, not yet. He wanted to be smart about how and when he brought this forward. He wanted it to land with maximum weight, instead of being dismissed or buried the way the earlier complaints apparently had been. But he made a decision sitting there in the glow of that small monitor. He would not let this go the way the last one had gone. The disciplinary meeting took place 2 days later, in a conference room near the dean's office, formal in a way that made the whole situation feel heavier than it already was. Nora sat across a long table from Dean Marlowe, a representative from the athletics department and a university attorney present to observe. Colton wasn't in the room, but his father was. Gerald Ashford sat near the head of the table, calm, composed, dressed the way men dress when they've never once in their lives had to worry about how a room perceives them. The meeting was brief. The edited video was presented as evidence. The missing fund allegation was raised again, framed now as part of a broader pattern of concerning behavior. Nora's own account of events was heard noted and set carefully alongside the other information, as though her word carried equal weight to a video clip. And a scholarship fund's largest donor sitting 3 seats away, it did not carry equal weight. Not in that room. Not that day. Dean Marlowe delivered the decision with visible discomfort, choosing his words with the caution of a man who knew exactly how unfair the process had become, but lacked the will or the standing to stop it. Nora Whitlock would be placed on immediate academic suspension, pending a formal hearing scheduled for that Friday. 72 hours away. Her scholarship status would be frozen during the review. She would be required to vacate her dormitory temporarily, staying instead in university guest housing, separated from Sadie and the rest of her floor, until the matter was resolved. The Friday hearing, as it happened, had been scheduled to take place the same evening as the Ashford Scholarship Gala, the university's largest annual event, packed with donors, faculty, local press, and a public announcement of the year's scholarship recipients on a stage built specifically for that purpose. Nora sat perfectly still as the decision was read aloud, her hands folded in her lap, her face giving away nothing. But inside, something old and familiar began to stir. For the first time since the funeral, since the promise she'd made at her grandfather's graveside. Quiet but unmistakable. The same steady fire that used to rise in her chest in the final round of a fight she refused to lose. 72 hours. She walked out of that conference room with her spine straight and her chin level, the same way her grandfather taught her to walk out of a ring, no matter the scorecard. She headed toward the small guest room that would be her home for the next 3 days, carrying with her nothing but a single bag and a red headband folded carefully inside it. The guest room was smaller than her dorm, plain and impersonal, the kind of space designed for visiting parents rather than students in crisis. Nora set her bag down on the bed. She sat beside it for a long time, staring at the blank wall opposite her. letting the silence of the room settle around her like a second skin. She thought about calling her grandfather's old gym, the one Sam Rourke still ran back home. She thought about how strange it would feel. After 2 years of running from that world entirely, to need it again this badly, this fast. She unzipped her bag. She pulled out the red headband, turning it over in her hands the way she had so many nights before. "Stand tall, my girl." She traced the stitching with her thumb, feeling the small imperfections in the fabric where her grandfather's hand had wavered slightly on certain letters, evidence of a man who was better with his fists than a needle, but who had sat up late anyway, determined to make something meaningful for her with his own 2 hands. She thought about the 72 hours ahead of her, about the gala scheduled for Friday night, the same night as her hearing. Donors and cameras and speeches about integrity happening 1 floor below a room where her entire future at this school would be decided, by people who had already shown again and again which side of the scale they tended to favor. She thought about Colton's face in that parking lot, the calculated shift from confidence to victimhood in less than a second, like he'd rehearsed it his whole life without ever needing to consciously plan it. She thought about her grandfather's voice, low and steady, reminding her before every fight that the loudest person in the room rarely turns out to be the strongest one. For the first time in 2 years, Nora let herself sit with a hard question. She was alone in that small guest room, nothing but a headband and a closed door between her and the version of herself she'd tried so hard to leave behind. She allowed herself to ask something she'd refused to ask since the funeral. What if the reason she survived everything that had happened to her wasn't so she could disappear quietly into an ordinary life? What if it was so she'd be ready, exactly like this, exactly now, to stand tall one more time when it actually mattered? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in a long while, she let herself sit with the question instead of running from it. Somewhere behind her, in a small office lined with security monitors, an old man sat reviewing footage one more time, preparing himself for a decision that would cost him more than he was willing to admit out loud, but one he had already made peace with making. Walt watched the parking lot footage a 4th time that night, timestamps glowing steady in the corner of the screen, undeniable, unedited, waiting. He thought about the 72 hours the university had given Nora. He thought about the 15 years he'd spent in boxing gyms, learning that timing mattered as much in a corner as it did in the ring itself. A fighter could have the perfect counter and still lose everything by throwing it half a second too late. He wasn't going to let that happen this time. He picked up his phone, scrolled through an old contacts list he hadn't touched in years. He found a number he'd kept saved out of habit more than anything else, a number belonging to a man named Sam Rourke, whose name he recognized instantly from that same faded boxing magazine sitting in the cardboard box beneath his desk. He didn't call that night. It was late. He wanted to think carefully about what he'd say, but he typed the number into a fresh contact under Nora's grandfather's old gym. He set his phone down on the desk beside the monitor, feeling for the first time in years like he was finally about to do something that mattered. And somewhere else on campus, a professor closed her eyes for a long moment. She sat in an office lined with books and folders full of quiet patterns finally starting to make sense. Then she reached for her phone. She began making the first of several calls that would matter far more than she yet understood. Eleanor Voss called an old colleague first, a former dean of student affairs who had retired 3 years earlier under circumstances Eleanor had never fully understood at the time, but suspected now had something to do with the same pattern she'd been tracing through those quiet, conveniently closed files. The former dean answered on the 3rd ring, surprised to hear from her after so long. "Eleanor," he said, "it's been a while." "I need to ask you about something," Eleanor said without much preamble. "A complaint filed a few years back involving the Ashford family. I think you may remember it better than the official record does." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I wondered if somebody would ever call about that," the former dean said finally, his voice heavy with something that sounded like relief mixed with old regret. I've been waiting a long time to tell somebody the truth about what really happened. Eleanor sat forward in her chair, pulling a fresh legal pad toward her, pen ready. I'm listening, she said. Their conversation ran long into the night. By the time Eleanor finally hung up the phone, she had far more than a hunch to work with. She had names, dates, a clearer picture of exactly how many times this pattern had repeated itself, and exactly how much it had cost the students unlucky enough to find themselves on the wrong side of it. She thought about Nora Whitlock, sitting alone somewhere in guest housing tonight, carrying the weight of an accusation built on nothing but rumor and convenience. She thought about the 72 hours remaining before that girl's fate would be decided in a room full of people more interested in protecting a donor's reputation than uncovering the truth. Eleanor Voss had spent 30 years teaching students that words mattered, that truth mattered, that the quiet work of gathering evidence and building an honest argument was worth more in the end than any amount of noise or influence. She intended to prove that to herself one more time, in the 72 hours she had left to try. She looked at the clock on her office wall, well past midnight now. She thought about how strange it was. The biggest fight of this whole ordeal might end up being won or lost somewhere unexpected. Not in a ring, not in a parking lot, but in quiet phone calls made late at night. Calls made by people the world rarely thought to look for. An old professor, an old custodian, a retired dean carrying guilt he'd never had the chance to put down. None of them fighters in the way the world usually measured that word. All of them in their own way, about to prove otherwise. That same night, unable to sleep, Sadie sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the empty side of the room, the side that had belonged to Nora for less than 2 months. It already felt wrong, that emptiness, like the room itself missed her. She thought about texting Gus. She thought about calling her own parents just to hear a familiar voice. In the end, she did neither. She pulled out an old notebook instead and began writing down everything she remembered from the parking lot, every detail, every word Colton had said, every second in order while it was still fresh. She didn't know yet if it would matter, but she wanted it written down somewhere true, in case the only other version of that night belonged to somebody willing to lie about it. Somewhere across that quiet 3 people were quietly becoming something new. One sat in a small guest room. One in a laundry room turned confession booth. One in an office lined with old case files. They had never met for coffee, never shared a class, never once called themselves allies. But they were bound together now by nothing more than a shared refusal to look away. 72 hours remained. None of them intended to waste a single one. The guest room had a small window that faced the parking lot. Nora spent most of Wednesday sitting near it, watching students cross campus below, wrapped in a routine that no longer included her. She thought about withdrawing. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It came quiet, the way most real decisions do. Somewhere between one breath and the next, while she stared at nothing in particular. She thought about calling the registrar's office in the morning, asking what paperwork she'd need to sign to leave Ashworth for good. She had done this before, walked away from something that mattered rather than fight for it in front of an audience. She had done it with boxing. Some small, tired part of her wondered if walking away twice might simply be who she was now. Sadie found her there Wednesday evening. She'd talked her way past the guest housing front desk with nothing but persistence and a container of soup she'd made in the dorm kitchen. "You're not allowed to shut me out," Sadie said, setting the soup down on the small desk without asking permission. "Roommate rules. I looked it up. There isn't actually a rule, but I'm making one up right now." Nora managed a small laugh despite herself. "You can't just invent rules." "Watch me," Sadie said, sitting cross-legged on the end of the bed. "I've decided I'm very good at it." They sat together for a while, not talking about the hearing, not talking about Colton, just existing in the same small room, the way friends do when words would only make things heavier. Eventually, Sadie broke the silence. "You're thinking about leaving?" It wasn't a question. Nora didn't answer right away. It would be easier, she finally said. Easier isn't the same as right, Sadie said. You told me that yourself, first week of school, when I wanted to drop my chemistry class because the professor scared me. You said quitting because something's hard isn't the same as quitting because it's wrong for you. I don't remember saying anything that wise, Nora said. You did, Sadie insisted. I wrote it in my journal. I have a journal now. This is your fault. Nora shook her head, smiling despite the weight sitting on her chest. I just don't know if I have another fight left in me, she admitted quietly. Not this kind. Sadie reached over and took her hand. Steady. Certain. Then let the rest of us carry some of it, she said. You don't have to do this alone. You've been acting like you do since the day I met you. You don't. She pulled a small spiral notebook out of her jacket pocket, setting it on the bed between them. I wrote down everything from the parking lot, Sadie said. Every word Colton said. While it was still fresh in my head. It's not much, but it's something. Nora looked at the notebook for a long moment. Something in her chest loosened slightly. Thank you, she said softly. Gus arrived not long after. He'd heard through the dorm grapevine that Sadie had snuck in with soup. He decided he wasn't going to be left out of showing up. He knocked. Waited. Sat on the floor again the way he always did. Like taking up too much space in a room wasn't something that felt natural to him yet. I talked to some people, he said without much preamble, about what happened in the parking lot. Nora looked up. What people? A couple guys on the wrestling team, Gus said. Not Colton's crowd. There's more of them than you'd think who don't love watching him operate. One of them told me Tripp's been bragging about editing that video, cutting the part where Colton shoved you first. Would he say that to the dean? Nora asked. Something like hope flickering behind her tired eyes for the first time in days. Gus shook his head slowly. Not directly. Not yet, anyway. Everybody's scared of what happens to their standing on the team if they cross Colton, or worse, his father, but it tells you something. Not everybody believes the story he's selling. That matters, even if it's quiet. Nora sat with that for a long moment. I keep thinking about something my grandfather used to say, she said finally. Before every fight, he'd tell me the crowd doesn't decide who wins. The judges do. But the crowd decides what kind of story gets told about it afterward. She looked between Sadie and Gus, something steadying in her expression. Maybe I can't control what the judges decide Friday, she said, but I can decide what kind of person shows up to that hearing, whether I walk in like somebody who already believes she's lost or somebody who still believes the truth is worth standing up for, even if nobody with power is ready to hear it yet. That's more like it, Sadie said, squeezing her hand. That same evening across campus, Walt Higgins finally made the phone call he'd been putting off since Monday night. Sam Rourke answered on the second ring, gruff and unhurried, a voice that had spent 40 years in gyms loud enough to make anyone permanently comfortable speaking over noise. This is Sam, he said. Mr. Rourke, Walt said, suddenly unsure exactly how to begin. My name is Walt Higgins. I don't know if that name means anything to you. I used to referee amateur circuit fights years back. I believe I worked about you and Frank Whitlock were both in the corner for. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Cautious. I remember Frank talking about a ref who actually knew what he was watching, Sam said slowly. Rare thing back then. Why are you calling me now, Mr. Higgins, after all these years? Walt took a breath. Because Frank's granddaughter is a student at the university where I work, he said. In about 72 hours, this school is going to decide whether to throw her out. Over an accusation that isn't true, made by a boy whose father happens to fund half the buildings on this campus. Another pause. Longer this time. Tell me everything, Sam said, his voice suddenly sharp, focused, all business. Walt spent the next 20 minutes laying it out. The cake, the rumor about the missing fund, the parking lot, the footage he had, clear as day showing exactly what really happened. The hearing scheduled for Friday, timed to land on the same evening as the university's biggest fundraising gala. By the time he finished, Sam Rourke had gone very quiet on the other end of the line. Frank, Would have burned that whole building down before he let somebody railroad his granddaughter like that, Sam said finally, his voice tight with old grief and fresh anger. I'm not going to sit here and let it happen either. What do you need from me? I need someone who can confirm who she really is, Walt said. Someone with real standing, records, photographs, something that makes it impossible for a room full of people to keep pretending she's just some scholarship kid nobody would miss. I've got fight records going back 15 years, Sam said. Photos, a championship belt, sitting in a display case at my gym right now with her name engraved on the plate. I can be there by Friday afternoon. There's one more thing, Walt said carefully. She doesn't know I'm making this call. She spent 2 years trying to leave that part of her life behind. I don't want to take that choice away from her without her knowing. Sam was quiet for a moment. Then let's ask her first, he said. Frank raised that girl to make her own decisions, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. She deserves the same respect now. Walt agreed, relieved to hear those words from someone who understood the weight of what they were considering. The next morning, Thursday, with only a day left before the hearing, Walt requested a meeting with Nora in the small guest housing common room, careful to keep his voice steady as he explained what he and Sam had discussed the night before. Nora listened in silence, her expression unreadable through most of it. When Walt finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, staring at her hands. You called him without asking me first, she said. Not quite an accusation, more an observation. I did, Walt admitted. And I understand if that upsets you. I should have called you before I called him. I got ahead of myself. I saw a chance to help and I took it, without thinking enough about what it might cost you to have that part of your life exposed again, on your terms or not. Nora looked up at him, her eyes glassy but steady. That's not what upsets me, she said quietly. What upsets me is realizing how badly I wanted somebody to make that call, even though I couldn't bring myself to make it myself. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the emotion, though Walt made no move to react like it was anything to hide. I've spent 2 years telling myself I was protecting people by staying quiet about who I used to be, she said. Protecting Sadie, protecting Gus, protecting myself, mostly, from having to be that person again. The one everyone expected so much from. She looked down at the red headband, which she'd taken to carrying with her everywhere these last few days, folded in her jacket pocket like a small private anchor. But hiding hasn't protected anybody, she said. It just let Colton believe I was somebody small enough to push around without consequence. It let this whole school believe a lie was easier to swallow than the truth, because nobody bothered checking whether the truth was standing right in front of them. She looked up at Walt. Something resolved, settling behind her eyes. Call him back, she said. Tell him yes. Tell him I'm ready. Walt nodded, relief and pride mixing together in his weathered face. For what it's worth, he said, I think your grandfather would be awfully proud of the woman making that decision right now. Nora walked with him back toward the guest housing entrance, the late afternoon light slanting low through the windows, turning the whole hallway a warm, tired gold. Can I ask you something? She said as they walked. Why did you keep that boxing box under your desk all these years? You said yourself you hadn't opened it in ages. Walt considered the question for a moment, his pace slow and thoughtful. I suppose some part of me never fully let that life go even after I stopped being part of it, he said. You spend enough years around people willing to get hit in the face for something they believe in, discipline, respect, the idea that you can lose 10 rounds and still walk out with your dignity intact. It changes what you expect from the rest of the world. I kept that box because I wasn't ready to admit I missed being around people who understood that. Not until you walked into this building. Nora smiled, small but genuine. My grandfather used to say something similar, that the ring teaches you more about who you really are than almost anything else in life, because there's nowhere left to hide once the bell rings. Sounds like a man worth listening to, Walt said. He was, Nora said. I'm trying to remember that more, instead of just missing him. They reached the guest housing doors. Walt paused before heading back toward his evening rounds. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said. "You've already done the hardest part. You decided who you wanted to be in all this before anybody forced your hand. That matters more than any hearing ever could." Nora nodded, watching him go, feeling steadier than she had in days. Friday arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the whole campus glow gold under a bright, indifferent sky. The Ashford Scholarship Gala was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening, in the university's largest ballroom, an event years in the making, attended by nearly 200 donors, faculty members, and local reporters. Current scholarship students were expected to smile politely for photographs, while men in expensive suits congratulated themselves on their generosity. Nora's disciplinary hearing had been scheduled for 5 o'clock, quietly, in a smaller conference room 1 floor below the ballroom. Timed deliberately, though nobody would ever admit it outright, to conclude before the gala's real festivities began. A convenient arrangement for anybody hoping the whole matter would disappear quietly before the cameras arrived. That plan did not survive the day. At 4:30 that afternoon, Professor Eleanor Voss walked into Dean Marlowe's office, unannounced, a thick folder tucked under her arm. She closed the door firmly behind her. "We need to talk before that hearing starts," she said. She set the folder down on his desk with a weight that suggested she meant every word of it. Dean Marlowe looked at the folder, then at her, visibly uneasy. "Eleanor, I have a gala to attend in 90 minutes. Then I suggest you make time," Eleanor said, opening the folder and spreading its contents across his desk. "Because what's in here explains a pattern going back nearly a decade. Complaints against students connected to this university's largest donor family. Every single one of them closed within days. No real investigation. At least one staff member forced out of their job for daring to file one honestly." She let that sit in the air for a moment. "I spent 3 nights pulling this together," she continued. "I have names. I have a former dean willing to go on record about exactly how those complaints were handled and why. If this university proceeds with railroading a young woman this afternoon on the word of a boy with a history like this one here, is what I intend to do. Make sure every name in this folder becomes public knowledge, starting with the press already gathering downstairs for your gala." Dean Marlowe sat back slowly, the color draining slightly from his face as he flipped through the pages in front of him. "This is," he started, then stopped, searching for words. "This is a serious allegation, Eleanor." "It's a serious pattern," she corrected. "One this university has clearly known about and chosen to look away from more than once. I'm not asking you to destroy anybody's reputation today, Marlowe. I'm asking you to finally give somebody the honest hearing this institution has apparently forgotten how to provide." At 5 o'clock, the disciplinary hearing began exactly as scheduled in the small conference room 1 floor below the gala, already gathering above them. Nora sat at the long table, calm, dressed simply, her red headband folded in her jacket pocket, close enough to touch if she needed the reminder. Dean Marlowe sat across from her, visibly different from the man who had delivered her suspension days earlier, something steelier now in his posture, though he gave no outward sign yet of what had shifted. Gerald Ashford arrived a few minutes later, unhurried, dressed for the gala already, his tuxedo pressed and immaculate, the picture of a man who considered this small detour beneath his evening but necessary to properly close out. What he did not expect was to find Walt Higgins standing quietly near the back of the room, a laptop tucked under his arm. Or Sam Rourke seated beside Eleanor Voss, a worn leather case resting on his lap. Or Professor Voss herself, seated at the head of the table this time, invited by Dean Marlowe under circumstances Gerald Ashford had not been briefed on. "What is this?" Gerald said, glancing around the room with the first flicker of genuine unease anyone had seen from him. "This," Dean Marlowe said, his voice steadier than it had been all week, "is us doing this hearing properly, something I regret we failed to do the first time around." Walt stepped forward, setting his laptop on the table, turning the screen toward the room. "I'd like to submit footage from a private security camera I installed and maintain outside the North Dormitory," he said, his voice calm but firm. It shows the full incident from Wednesday night in the parking lot, uninterrupted, time-stamped, unedited. He pressed play. The room watched in silence as the footage rolled. Colton approaching Sadie, Nora arriving, stepping between them, Colton shoving forward, his own momentum sending him stumbling over the curb, falling on his own. Nothing but empty air where Nora had been standing a half-second earlier. Then his voice tinny through the laptop speaker, unmistakably clear. "She hit me. Everybody saw it. She just attacked me." The room sat in stunned silence when the footage ended. Gerald Ashford's jaw tightened, his composure cracking slightly for the first time. "That footage could have been altered," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "It's time-stamped and unedited straight from the original recording device," Walt said evenly. "I'd welcome any technical expert the university wants to bring in to verify that." Eleanor slid the thick folder across the table toward Dean Marlowe and Gerald Ashford both. "While we're verifying things," she said, "I think it's worth reviewing this as well. A record of every disciplinary complaint filed against a student connected to this family over the last 9 years. And the curious speed with which each one was closed." Gerald Ashford's face had gone pale now, the practiced composure of a lifetime slipping visibly for the first time in that room. "I don't know what you think you've found," he said, though the confidence had drained from his voice. "But my son has never once faced a real consequence in this school because he has never once done anything worth one." "With respect," Sam Rourke said, speaking for the first time, his gravelly voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "I think it's time somebody in this room learned exactly who they've spent the last month trying to bury." He opened the worn leather case on his lap. He produced a folder of his own, sliding photographs and official fight records across the table. Nora sat very still beside him, watching the room absorb what they were seeing. A young woman, unmistakably Nora, standing in the center of a boxing ring, gloves raised high, a championship belt slung over one shoulder. A roaring crowd blurred behind her in the photograph. "This is Nora Whitlock," Sam said, though for the better part of 6 years most people knew her by a different name. The Iron Rose. Youngest featherweight world champion this country has produced in over 2 decades, trained from the age of 9 by her grandfather Frank Whitlock, a man of more honor and discipline than most people in positions of real power will ever manage to have. He let that settle before continuing. She stepped away from the sport 2 years ago after her grandfather passed away at ringside, during what would have been the final fight of her championship run. She walked away from money, from fame, from a career most fighters would trade anything for, because she needed to grieve like a human being instead of a headline. She came to this university looking for something quiet, something normal. Instead, she was mocked in front of her entire freshman class, accused of theft on nothing but rumor, and now accused of assault based on footage doctored to protect the very boy who instigated all of it. Dean Marlowe sat in stunned silence, staring at the photographs on the table. Gerald Ashford stared too, though something different was moving behind his eyes now, something closer to shame than shock. "I want to be clear about something," Nora said quietly, speaking for the first time since the hearing began. Every head in the room turned toward her. "I didn't come here for an apology built on who I used to be. I'd have wanted the truth defended just the same if I was nobody at all. If I was exactly the scholarship kid your son decided to make fun of that first night, with no championship belt, no famous grandfather, nothing behind my name but hard work and hope. That version of me deserved the truth just as much as this one does." The room was silent for a long moment. There was a knock at the door. Dean Marlowe frowned. "We're in the middle of something," he called out. The door opened anyway. Gus stood in the doorway out of breath like he'd run the whole way from wherever he'd been. Sadie stood just behind him, holding her small spiral notebook against her chest. "I'm sorry," Gus said, stepping into the room without waiting to be invited. "I heard this was happening. I couldn't just sit outside and let it happen without saying something." Dean Marlowe looked between Gus and the panel, uncertain. "And you are—" "Gus Bellamy," he said. "A student here. I've watched what's happened to Nora since the first week of school. I watched Colton mock her. I watched him mock me, for that matter, over something I can't help. I didn't say anything for weeks because I was scared of what it would cost me. I'm done being scared. He walked further into the room, his voice steadying with every step. He tried to bully me the same way he bullied her, Gus said. I have a text message from him threatening to make my life difficult if I ever spoke up about the cake. I saved it. I didn't know why at the time. I think some part of me knew I'd need it eventually. He held up his phone. Sadie stepped forward beside him. And I wrote down everything from the parking lot that same night, Sadie said, opening her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. Every word Colton said. While it was still fresh, I know it's not the same as a camera, but it's the truth written down before anybody had a chance to change it. Dean Marlowe looked around the table, at Walt's footage, at Sam's records, at Eleanor's folder, at Gus's phone, at Sadie's notebook, offered up by two students who had nothing to gain from standing in that room, except the simple relief of finally being heard. Let the record show, Dean Marlowe said slowly, that this university received sworn testimony today from multiple independent witnesses, all corroborating the same account. None of them coached. None of them coordinated in advance. Gerald Ashford said nothing. He looked for the first time since he'd walked into that room like a man who understood exactly how much ground had shifted beneath him. Dean Marlowe closed the folder slowly, his hands not quite steady. I think, he said, choosing his words with visible care, this hearing requires considerably more time and a considerably different set of conclusions than we originally planned for this evening. He looked across the table at Nora, something like genuine regret settling into his expression. Miss Whitlock, he said, on behalf of this institution, I owe you a far more serious apology, more than I'm capable of giving you in this room today. The suspension is lifted, effective immediately. Your scholarship status will be fully restored. I intend to personally ensure that every complaint filed against you this semester is formally withdrawn from your record, with a written acknowledgement of the circumstances attached. Thank you, Nora said quietly. But I'd ask you to think about more than just my record. There were others before me. Their names are probably in that same folder. Dean Marlowe nodded slowly. I intend to address every one of them. You have my word for whatever that's worth to you today. It's worth something, Nora said. Actions will be worth more. Gerald Ashford said nothing. He simply sat there staring at the photographs of a young champion. He'd spent weeks dismissing her as nothing more than an easy target for his son's cruelty. The full weight of what his family's influence had allowed to happen finally beginning to settle over him. Upstairs, the gala was already underway. Chandeliers blazing, string quartet playing softly near the entrance, nearly 200 guests mingling with champagne glasses in hand, waiting for the evening's featured speeches to begin. Word travels fast in a building with thin walls and nervous staff. By the time Gerald Ashford made his way upstairs, visibly shaken, the first ripples of rumor had already started moving through the crowd, whispered between donors who had noticed campus security gathering near the stairwell, and a small cluster of reporters who had caught wind that something unusual was happening one floor below the party. Gerald Ashford was scheduled to give the evening's keynote address, a tradition every year, the same warm words about opportunity, integrity, and the transformative power of generosity that had opened this gala for the last decade. He walked to the podium at 7:15 that evening, later than scheduled, his composure fighting visibly to reassemble itself under the bright stage lighting. He began his speech the way he always did, thanking the university, thanking the donors, speaking about the values this institution claimed to represent. He was 3 minutes into his remarks when Dean Marlowe walked onto the stage beside him, unscheduled, uninvited, carrying a small folder of his own. The room went quiet, murmuring rising at the unexpected interruption. I apologize for the disruption, Dean Marlowe said, taking the podium gently from a stunned Gerald Ashford. But I believe, given the theme of tonight's remarks, that this university owes its guests, and one particular student, a more honest account of the last several weeks than has been circulating. What followed was not the speech anyone in that room had expected to hear. Dean Marlowe spoke plainly about the disciplinary case that had unfolded that evening, careful with names and details in a way that respected the process still technically underway, but honest about the pattern the university had allowed to persist for years. He spoke about a young woman falsely accused, about doctored footage, about complaints buried for the sake of protecting reputations that had never truly deserved that protection in the first place. He did not name Nora directly out of respect for her privacy. He didn't need to. Enough of the room had already heard the whispers moving through the crowd to understand exactly who he meant. Gerald Ashford stood frozen at the edge of the stage throughout the entire address, his face a mixture of humiliation and something that, for the first time in a very long time, looked almost like genuine reckoning. Near the back of the ballroom, having slipped upstairs quietly after the hearing recessed, Nora stood beside Walt, Sam, Eleanor, Gus, and Sadie, watching the scene unfold with a strange, disbelieving calm. "I never wanted it to happen like this," she said quietly. "Sometimes," Eleanor said gently, "the truth doesn't wait for the tidy moment we planned for it. It just finds the loudest room available and walks in anyway." That was when Colton appeared. He'd heard about the hearing's outcome secondhand, the same way rumors always traveled faster than facts. He arrived at the gala already furious, already humiliated in front of friends, family, and half the local press corps gathered for the evening. He spotted Nora near the back of the ballroom. Something in him, some final thread of restraint that had never been particularly strong to begin with, finally snapped completely. "You," he said, crossing the room fast, voice raised, drawing eyes from every direction. "You did this. You ruined everything over some stupid cake." "Colton?" Gerald Ashford called from the stage, alarm cutting through his own humiliation. "Not here." Colton wasn't listening. He closed the last few feet between himself and Nora fast, anger overriding whatever judgment he had left. He grabbed her by the arm, hard enough to make Sadie, standing nearby, gasp aloud. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Watched by nearly 200 stunned onlookers and at least 4 separate cameras, Nora's free hand came up, catching Colton's wrist in a smooth, practiced motion, redirecting his own momentum instead of resisting it directly. A small pivot of her hips, a subtle shift of her weight. Colton found himself suddenly off balance, his grip broken, his arm turned gently but firmly behind him, guided down into a controlled, stable position that left him kneeling on the ballroom floor without a single punch ever having been thrown. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Nora held the position only long enough to be certain he wasn't getting back up to try again. Her voice, low, steady, meant only for him, even in a room full of witnesses. "You've had more chances than most people ever get," she said quietly. "You just used up the last one." She released him and stepped back, her breathing calm, controlled, not a single hair out of place. Colton knelt there on the ballroom floor, stunned, humiliated, in front of the exact crowd he'd spent his entire life performing for. Finally understanding, far too late, exactly what kind of person he'd chosen to make an enemy of. Campus security arrived moments later, along with 2 uniformed police officers who had been present for the gala's routine event coverage. Quickly assessing the situation from multiple witness accounts and the growing number of phone videos already capturing the scene from every angle, Colton was escorted out of the ballroom, still protesting, still insisting he was the victim, though nobody in that room was inclined to believe him anymore. Gerald Ashford stood at the podium watching his son being led away, the weight of the entire evening finally completely settling over him. He stepped down from the stage slowly, crossing the ballroom floor toward Nora, who watched him approach with calm, unreadable eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, close enough now that only she, Sadie, and Walt could hear him clearly. "Not the kind you give for a photograph, a real one." "I don't need a photograph," Nora said evenly. Gerald nodded slowly, something humbled in his posture that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "I let my son grow up believing money could fix anything he broke," he said. I told myself I was protecting him. I was really just teaching him nobody would ever hold him accountable. I did the same thing to this school without ever fully admitting it to myself. I let it happen because it was easier than facing what kind of man I'd allowed him to become. He glanced toward the stairwell where Colton had been led away, something raw and honest crossing his face. "That ends tonight," he said. "Whatever it takes to make this right, starting with you, I intend to do it properly this time." Nora studied him for a long moment, searching, careful. The way she'd once studied opponents across a ring, looking for whether an apology carried real weight or just the practiced shape of one. "Then start with the ones who came before me," she said. "The ones whose complaints got buried the same way mine almost did. Start there, and I'll believe you mean it." Gerald Ashford nodded slowly, something in his expression suggesting he understood exactly what she meant and exactly how much work that would require. He hesitated a moment longer before turning to leave, then looked back at her once more. "For what it's worth," he said, "I hope my son learns eventually whatever it was your grandfather managed to teach you. It's clearly worth more than anything I ever gave mine." He walked away then, back toward the stairwell where his son had been led out, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there at the start of the evening. Sadie stepped up beside Nora once he'd gone, still a little breathless from everything that had just unfolded in front of 200 witnesses and several very confused reporters.
"Did that actually just happen?" she said. "All of it? Please tell me that actually just happened."
Nora let out a long breath, some of the tension finally draining from her shoulders. "I think it did," she said. "You just took down the biggest bully on this campus in front of the entire donor board," Sadie said, half laughing, half still in shock. "Without throwing a single punch. That's the most Iron Rose thing I've ever seen, and I've never even seen you fight." Nora managed a real laugh then, the first easy one she'd had all week. "My grandfather always said the best fighters are the ones who never need to throw the first punch," she said. "Or the last one, if they can help it." Gus stood a little apart, watching the whole scene with something like quiet awe. "I've never done anything like that before," he admitted when Nora caught his eye. "Standing up in a room like that, my hands were shaking the whole time." "Doesn't matter if your hands shake," Nora said, walking over to him. "What matters is you walked in anyway. That's the only kind of brave that counts." Walt approached a moment later, closing his laptop carefully under one arm, a rare, wide smile breaking across his usually reserved face. "I haven't felt this useful in a very long time," he said. "Thank you for letting me make that call." "Thank you for making it," Nora said, "even without asking me first." "I won't make a habit of that part," Walt said, and they both laughed. The kind of laugh that only comes after something heavy has finally been set down. Sam Rourke lingered near the back of the ballroom a little longer than the others, watching the crowd slowly return to something resembling normal gala conversation. Murmurs of shock and admiration rippling through the room in equal measure. He found Nora a few minutes later standing quietly near a window, watching snow flurries just beginning to drift past the glass outside. "Your grandfather used to stand exactly like that," Sam said, coming to stand beside her. "Right before a fight, watching something out past everybody else in the room like he already knew how the night was going to end." "Did he?" Nora said softly. "Every time," Sam said, "and he was almost always right." Nora turned to face him. "Thank you for coming, for bringing all of it. I know it wasn't an easy trip on short notice." "Wasn't a question," Sam said simply. "Frank would have done the same for anybody I loved without needing to be asked twice. Least I could do was return the favor." He studied her for a moment, something gentle in his weathered expression. "You know," he said, "you don't have to stay hidden anymore, not if you don't want to. The world's going to find out who you are eventually, one way or another, now that tonight happened in front of half the local press." Nora considered that, watching the snow fall a little longer before answering. "I think I'm finally ready for that," she said. "I spent 2 years running from it because I thought being Iron Rose was the reason I lost him. I'm starting to understand it was never the fighting that took him from me. It was just time, the way it eventually takes everybody. Hiding from that truth didn't bring him back. It just kept me from living the life he actually wanted for me. Sam nodded slowly, pride evident in every line of his weathered face. Then let's build something worth him being proud of, he said. Whenever you're ready. She was ready sooner than either of them expected. The weeks that followed brought changes to Ashworth that few students could have predicted at the start of the semester. Colton was formally expelled. It followed a full review of the parking lot incident, the doctored video, and several other complaints. Complaints that resurfaced once students realized coming forward finally carried real consequences instead of quiet retaliation. He lost his wrestling scholarship. He lost his standing at the university. And perhaps most painfully for a young man who'd never known anything else, he lost the protective shield his family's name had always provided him. Gerald Ashford, in the weeks following the gala, made good on his promise. He funded an independent review of every disciplinary complaint filed against students connected to major donor families over the past decade. Results published publicly despite considerable pressure from within the university's own board to keep the findings quiet. He also did something nobody expected. He approached Nora privately, weeks after the initial apology, with a proposal. He wanted to fund a community boxing gym open to Ashworth students and local residents alike. A space built around discipline, mentorship, and second chances. He wanted to name it after her grandfather. Nora sat with the offer for several days before accepting, on one condition, that Walt Higgins be brought on as its head instructor alongside herself. His decades of overlooked experience finally put to use in a role that honored it properly. Sam Rourke helped design the training program. He traveled out twice a month to consult. Occasionally, he stepped into the ring himself, delighted, in his own gruff way, to see Frank Whitlock's legacy carried forward somewhere new. The gym opened in early December, a modest brick building on the edge of campus, simple and unassuming from the outside. Filled with the same worn, honest energy of every good gym Nora had ever trained in. On opening day, a small crowd gathered inside. Mostly students, a handful of local families. Ruth from the dining hall took the afternoon off just to see it for herself. She proudly told anyone nearby that she'd known Nora was somebody special from the very first week. Near the entrance, mounted carefully in a simple wooden frame, hung the red headband. Cleaned now, the frosting long since washed away. The stitching still slightly uneven where an old man's steady hands had once wavered over three small, important words. Beneath it, a small plaque read simply, "In memory of Frank Whitlock, who taught us that standing tall isn't about how loud you are. It's about who you choose to become when nobody thinks you're watching." Gus became one of the gym's first regular members, showing up twice a week despite his limp. Determined and steady, slowly building a strength in himself that had nothing to do with his legs at all. Sadie came too, mostly for the company. She surprised everyone, including herself, by turning out to have a genuinely solid jab once Nora spent a few sessions correcting her stance. Eleanor Voss stopped by occasionally, never to train, simply to sit near the back and watch. A quiet smile crossed her face whenever she saw Nora correcting a young student's form, with the same patience her grandfather had clearly passed down to her. On one such afternoon, Eleanor found herself talking with Ruth. Ruth had taken to stopping by after her dining hall shifts ended. She claimed she just liked the atmosphere, though everyone suspected she mostly liked watching the young woman she'd once slid a free coffee across a counter to, watching her become exactly the person she'd always suspected she could be. "Never would have guessed it that first week," Ruth said, watching Nora demonstrate a combination to a nervous new student. "Girl covered in frosting, standing there so calm it near broke my heart. Figured she'd either crumble by October or surprise every last one of us." "She surprised us," Eleanor said, "though I suspect crumbling was never really on the table. Some people are just built with a floor under them the rest of us have to go looking for." Ruth nodded slowly, watching a moment longer. Guess we're lucky she found hers here, and not somewhere that wouldn't have noticed at all. Eleanor thought about that a long while after she left the gym that day. about all the quiet floors people carried without anyone ever bothering to look for them. She made a small, private promise to herself to keep looking a little more carefully from now on in every classroom she ever stood in front of again. Nora stood in the center of that gym most afternoons now, gloves in hand, guiding students through drills, her voice calm and steady, carrying the same quiet authority that had once filled arenas 20 times this size. She thought about her grandfather often in that space, though the grief had softened now into something closer to gratitude. She understood, finally, standing in a gym that bore his name, filled with people learning to stand a little taller because of the lessons he'd first taught her. Some legacies aren't meant to end quietly in a promise made at a graveside. Some are meant to keep teaching, long after the person who built them is gone, through every student who steps through the door ready to learn what it really means to stand tall. On a cold evening in mid-December, Nora locked up the gym after the last student had gone home. She paused for a moment beneath the small plaque near the entrance, her hand resting gently against the glass, protecting the old red headband inside its frame. "We did it, Grandpa," she said quietly, the words barely more than breath in the empty room. Outside, snow had begun to fall softly over Ashworth, dusting the quad in white, the campus settling into the quiet stillness of another semester's end. Somewhere behind her, in a small brick building that hadn't existed 3 months earlier, a legacy continued, one that had once nearly ended at ringside. Steady and unhurried now, exactly the way its founder would have wanted it to. She thought, walking home through the falling snow that night, about the freshman who had arrived at Ashworth back in August, carrying 2 suitcases, and a promise to stay small, to stay quiet, to be nobody worth noticing. That girl felt distant now, like someone she'd once known briefly rather than someone she'd been. She was not sorry for the year that had brought her here, not the cake, not the cruelty, not even the fear that had kept her silent for so long. All of it somehow had led her back to the version of herself her grandfather had spent his whole life building. Patient round after patient round, one lesson at a time. Stand tall, my girl. She always had, even when nobody was watching, especially then.